По 77 години мир во Европа, 24 февруари ќе биде забележан како датум на најголемата агресија во Европа од крајот на Втората светска војна. Русија ја нападна Украина, дошт од руски проектили врз украинските градови. Започна инвазија од земја, воздух и море. Светот се дигна. Лидерите бараат акција и санкции за Москва. Генералниот секретар на Обединетите нации порача: дајте му шанса на мирот, премногу луѓе загинаа. Гледате Европат. Останете со нас. Неколку минути по обраќањето на Путин се случија првите експлозии во украинските градови. За Путин тоа е акција со која ќе ја демилитаризира и денацилизира Украина. Украинскиот председател Зеленски, кој има еврејски корени, ги демантира обвинувањата дека Украина ја водат нацисти. Путин се однесува како нацист. Украинци, земете оружје, кажа Зеленски.
Обстоятельства требуют от нас решительных и незамедлительных действий. Народные республики Донбасса обратились к России с просьбой о помощи. В связи с этим, в соответствии со статьей 51 части 7 Устава ООН, санкции Совета Федерации России и во исполнение ратифицированных Федеральным собранием 22 февраля сего года договоров о дружбе и взаимопомощи с Донецкой Народной Республикой и Луганской Народной Республикой, мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. Призываю вас немедленно сложить оружие и идти домой. Поясню. Все военнослужащие украинской армии, которые выполнят это требование, смогут беспрепятственно покинуть зону боевых действий и вернуться к своим семьям. Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
Шановні громадяни України, сьогодні вранці президент Путін оголосив проведення спеціальної військової операції на Донбасі. Росія здійснила удари по нашій військовій інфраструктурі та по нашим прикордонникам, прикордонним загонам. В багатьох містах України було чутно вибухи. Ми вводимо воєнний стан на всій території нашої держави. Хвилину тому я провів розмову з президентом Байденом. Сполучені Штати Америки вже почали гуртувати міжнародну підтримку. Сьогодні від вас, від кожного з вас потрібно спокій. По можливості залишайтесь, будь ласка, вдома. Ми працюємо. Армія працює. Працює весь сектор безпеки і оборони України.
Кремљ порача дека воената операција во Украина ќе трае онолку колку што е потребно. Во Киев поставени се црвени стрели насликани на зидовите кои ги означуваат локациите на најблиските засолништа од бомби. Украинците ги напуштаат домовите и се движат кон Полска. Во следното интервју разговараме со Гералд Кнауст од Европската иницијатива за стабилност. Русија изврши воен удар врз Украина. Експлозии во Киев, Харков и Одеса. Путин порача дека било каков обид за мешање ќе води кон жестоки последици. Дали е ова порака дека е спремен да оди до крај и што е најпотребно да се направи сега?
Well, first of all, this is really the worst case scenario. It is something that American officials have predicted based on their intelligence, that Putin is determined to invade all of Ukraine, to topple the government, to replace the democratically elected institutions, and to turn all Ukraine into a client state occupied by Russia. That is the worst case scenario, and Putin has now confirmed in 2 speeches that this is what he intends to do. So there are 2 possible outcomes now, both tragic. One is that the Ukrainian forces can hold back this attempted invasion. This will very likely lead to a lot of casualties, a lot of people dying. And it could lead to a very, very bitter and long fight, including in the big cities. Or alternatively, and that is what Putin must be hoping for, he will succeed in overwhelming with his military power Ukrainian institutions and will be able to establish a new government. Then it would be an aggression similar to the attack on Poland in 1939, which of course was also based on a pact, an agreement at that time between Hitler's National Socialist Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, when Poland was attacked, and then in a very short period of time, resistance collapsed due to the overwhelming power of the invading armies. In that case, we can predict hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, perhaps more, trying to flee from Ukraine because, of course, they will be afraid of repression, arrests, and indeed of not wanting to live in this kind of Russia-dominated colony, which Ukraine, in Putin's vision, should become.
Срушени згради, закинати цивили, руски трупи влегуваат и преку Крим. Паниката е голема. Како да се заштити цивилното население?
Well, I think the priority must remain, and now this is a test for Europe and its allies and the United States and others. The priority must be to make the price that Putin's Russia has to pay as high as possible. There has been a lot of talk about sanctions, the like of which Russia has never experienced. Some have probably thought this is a bluff, including in the Kremlin. So now the test is the European Union, are the Americans, is the United Kingdom, are other allies like Japan and South Korea and Australia ready to really impose severe economic and political sanctions? For example, expelling Russia or suspending Russia in the Council of Europe, where North Macedonia also has a vote. It is inconceivable that a country that attacks and dismembers and violates all basic rights of neighboring other members can remain in the Council of Europe. So I think this should be a clear signal very soon to expel Russia. But realistically, this will not be enough. And to protect the civilians, of course, the second thing is to leave open, as at the moment, the possibility for people to flee Ukraine, to enter the European Union, which they can without requiring a visa. For those who have to flee for political reasons because of the war, the European Union needs to send a clear signal. It is ready to allow people in.
Украина побара од Анкара да ги затвори Босфорот и Дарданелите за руските бродови. Бајден порача дека Путин избра војна која ќе биде со катастрофални загуби. Дали може да дојде до голема светска конфронтација?
Well, so far, and this is really remarkable, the predictions by the US intelligence community and by the US government, which it made public, have been almost completely accurate. From the attempted false flag provocative incidents that Russia would stage to give itself a reason, an alleged reason to intervene, to the extent of the mobilization, to the focus to take Ukraine and overwhelm it. All of what the Americans have until now predicted has actually happened. And that means that other fears, for example, the idea that there were already lists of people to be arrested, to be executed. I mean, Putin has shown no scruples to execute people outside of Russia in recent years, that these fears will also come true. At the same time, Putin has made very clear in recent weeks that he views not just Ukraine, but all former parts of the Soviet Union and the European Union as a whole as an enemy. So what we are seeing in the best case scenario is a new Cold War, where Europe is dividing into two parts again, as it has been in the Cold War, where it is clear that Russia is leading and considers other Europeans as enemies and is leading an autocratic coalition. It has occupied Belarus. It is supporting enemies of democracy inside European democracies. And that is the best case scenario, is that this will remain a Cold War. The worst case scenario is that Russia's aggression will go beyond Ukraine. And that really poses a completely new challenge also to NATO and to the Europeans, because NATO's future itself is at the moment very much dependent on who the American president is. And if there should be a different American president in 2024 with the attitude towards NATO that we have seen with Donald Trump, and the attitude towards Russia that Donald Trump has shown in recent days again, then even NATO will not be enough to protect the Europeans. And then the Europeans really need to think of how they can protect themselves. And that is going to be the major political challenge for the next 2 years.
Украинскиот министер за надворешни работи повика светот да го запре Путин. Во исто време, ЕУ и НАТО свика итен состанок на лидерите. Какви санкции се најпотребни за да не дојде до ескалација?
Well, one thing has become very clear. The Russian leadership believes, and some of the members of the Security Council that took the decision to escalate publicly in their meeting this week, earlier this week on Monday, have said this, that the sanctions the European Union or the Americans are going to impose will not be a big problem. That in the end, the Europeans are weak. In the end, the West is corrupt. In the end, economic interests will limit the sanctions. And that, if that is the lesson that is now confirmed, again, would be very, very dangerous for the future of stability in Europe. So it's in the European interest, and of course, the interest of NATO, to show that Russia miscalculated. And this means that even if there are costs for Germany and Italy and France and others in the European Union, the sanctions must be very tough, including hitting the Russian banking sector, key parts of Russian industry, and showing Putin that even if this inflicts costs, the Europeans are not afraid. Unless this takes place, the next crisis, which could be very, very soon, with another European country that is the target of Russian aggression, it would be even more difficult to intimidate and deter another attack. So it is a vital issue that these sanctions now, however difficult it is to agree on them in the European Union, will be as tough and as unprecedented. And there is a model. I mean, we have the sanctions against Iran that have been very, very tough, cutting off Iran from international trade. I think something similar will now be needed to deal with Russia.
Дали после ова може да се очекува уште една голема бегалска криза?
Well, until 2 days ago, we didn't know what kind of war it would be. Now we do not know how long this war will last. It's useful, but also, of course, limiting to think with historical examples and analogies. I can think of 3 that give us an idea of what might happen. One is, if this goes according to Putin's plan and he very quickly manages to get to Kiev, topple the government, install a puppet government and an occupation authority. That is, of course, what the Soviet Union did in Hungary in 1956 to get rid of a reform communist government and install a government loyal to the Soviet Union. And at that time, hundreds of thousands of Hungarians, more than 250,000, who did not want to live in this puppet communist Soviet-controlled Hungary, fled to Austria. So there were then almost 250,000 or more than 250,000 Hungarians who didn't want to live there. If this happens in Ukraine, we can expect hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians for sure who will be afraid of repression or who will simply say, we do not want to live in this Ukraine that is controlled by Russia, fleeing to the European Union. The other scenario, which is perhaps even more dramatic, is that the war is like Syria and lasts for a very long time, and that it is a war that is fought in many cities throughout the country. And in that case, we can predict an even larger number of refugees. Whether they leave Ukraine, we do not know, but it could very easily, and remember, in Syria, within 3 years, more than 6 million Syrians fled to the neighboring countries, and another few million are displaced inside the country. Now, that is the second scenario. In both scenarios, Europe should prepare and should be open to welcome Ukrainians who will have to flee to the European Union. I mean, I just realized, one of Putin's arguments for this war is to say that Ukrainians have an artificial identity, an identity created by Lenin and communism. And that is, of course, a completely crazy argument, as crazy as the argument that Macedonians or Austrians or Swiss or Germans have an artificial identity. But it shows us how dangerous these kinds of arguments are, especially if they are linked to a dictator with one of the strongest militaries in the world. So Putin has shown that he's actually waging war not against any concrete threat, but against the very essence of Ukrainian identity as a people.
Руските трупи не се повлекуваат од Белорусија, иако рокот за повлекување одамна заврши. Напротив, континуирано пристигнуваат војници во државата. По рускиот напад на Украина, Лукашенко изјави дека не учествувал во војните операции. Во следното интервју разговараме со Андреј Саников, екс-председателски кандидат во Белорусија. Саников беше осуден на 5 години затворска казна за учеството во протестите што го оспоруваа повторниот избор на Лукашенко пред една деценија. Ослободен под притисок на ЕУ, а сега во екзил во Полска. Украина прогласи воена и вонредна состојба. Што треба да направи украинската влада следно?
I think it is a necessary move, because when there is a war and when there is an aggression, you have to deal with it in a different way than the peaceful life, unfortunately. So the state of emergency is absolutely warranted and appropriate. And the use of, first of all, it's not yet became a law, but I think it's also a reasonable move. Why? Because it is today the situation for Putin, for Russian troops, is different from 2014. Today, Ukraine has a different army, and the mood in Ukraine is completely different from 8 years ago. If 8 years ago they were kind of at a loss, and they didn't have adequate military force to counter Russians, they didn't have. Actually, they didn't expect, as all of us didn't expect, such a bold, such a aggressive move on the part of Russia. Today it's completely different. Ukrainians are getting ready to meet the enemy, and for this they require armaments. I know that this issue was discussed for quite a long time in Ukraine, in Rada, and I think that the Russia's actions, they just sped up the decision. The decision came because of Russian activities on the borders and in Ukraine.
Руската армија е се уште присутна во Белорусија и тоа во огромен број. Колку Москва во овие моменти ја загрозува независноста и на Белорусија?
I think that they have to be called an occupation army today, because they promised, and we know it's not only the promise, it was done under the international treaties and agreements, that the drills will be over on the 20th of February, and the military forces will be withdrawn together with armaments. Since it didn't happen, then today it's occupation force, but it's a good question about the independence and sovereignty, because first of all, the presence was authorized by Lukashenko, who is not legitimate, who is not recognized by international community. First, and second, he was not even consulted. It was Kremlin decision, and it shows that today Lukashenko just a puppet, just he cannot decide anything, and that is why I think that the international community should treat this action as a part of aggressive activity against Ukraine. It's nothing less, because the Russian troops not only are stationed today on the territory of Belarus, they keep coming. And even today we had the videos and information of Russian troops and Russian armaments and Russian vehicles coming closer to the Ukrainian border through the territory of Belarus. So I think it's quite a dangerous situation, and I represent Civil Campaign European Belarus, and we demand immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from the territory of Belarus, because that's what Belarusian people want, and not the illegitimate dictator Lukashenko.
Руските трупи требаше да бидат сместени во Белорусија само за воени вежби. Дали Лукашенко погрешно се постави во преговорите со Путин и сега е измамен?
He was not negotiating with Putin. He was completely counting on the support of Putin. First of all, money, and that is why he will obey any order coming from Kremlin today. He is not an independent politician anymore. He wasn't independent for a long time, but today it is clear that Kremlin doesn't have even to formally ask him to do anything it wants on the territory of Belarus, especially from the military point of view. And this can be also very dangerous.
Русија започна инвазија на Украина. Дали може да се очекува дека и Белорусија ќе се вклучи во иднина во нападот?
I think that definitely Putin is contemplating this kind of plan. That is why the Russian forces are concentrated on the border with Ukraine from the territory of Belarus. And definitely it is, military they don't think in complicated terms. If they concentrate large numbers of military forces, it means that they plan to use them. And if the forces are concentrated on the border of Ukraine from the territory of Belarus, it means that the Russian generals want to use them. And that is the danger. I also heard the statements coming from European Union, from United States, that if it happens, then Lukashenko will be considered aggressor as well as Kremlin. I think these are appropriate statements, and today we also wait for sanctions to be applied not only to Kremlin but to Lukashenko regime for supporting this kind of aggression.
Господине Саников, има ли надеж дека Лукашенко некогаш ќе се замине од власт?
He already doesn't control the situation in the country. This kind of situation with Ukraine, with Russian aggression against Ukraine, show that he is not controlling even in his dealings with Moscow. He lost the control of the economic situation in the country. He is not trusted anymore even by his own people, and he is keeping the power only with violence, with extensive violence that he's still using. We have several thousand of political prisoners now in prison. The arrests are going on daily basis. But it shows that how weak he is, because almost 2 years after the protests started, he is still fighting people, even pensioners, even kids, because he is really scared that he is removed from power. No, these people like Lukashenko, Putin, they are not thinking of leaving the power, but inevitably it is leading to the worst case scenario for them.
Што после Лукашенко? Дали во иднина на Белорусија може да и се случи истото сценарио како на Украина, со оглед на тоа дека и таму има проруски и прозападни чувства?
I don't think that there are so many. First of all, it's a different situation in Belarus, and I don't think there are pro-Russian sentiments, and there are no so much anti-Russian sentiments. We don't have such a distinct separation or distinct differences between eastern and western parts in Belarus, as Ukrainians, for example, do. And if during the protest, which started, I would say, during the revolution that started in 2020, it was clear that people were protesting against Lukashenko and not connecting Kremlin with Lukashenko, although Kremlin was supporting Lukashenko, and it is the only source of support today. I mean, outside Belarusian, outside this violence apparatus in Belarus, it's Kremlin that supports the dictator. So I don't think that it is a similar situation. We can compare the situation. But the threat from Russia, of course, is really, it's a real threat. It is present, and we have to reckon with this. Although I think that after Lukashenko, since you ask, we will have quite a fast reform going on in the country, because it's not only that he is keeping Belarus under dictatorship and trying to keep his power, but because of that, because of his incompetence, he is bankrupt now everywhere, in economic area, in social area, and the people are not capable to realize their potential in Belarus today. So I think that the moment is overdue to start reforming the country, and starting from the economy, and then the political system as well.
Гледавте Европат. Останете со програмата на телевизија 24.